Picture a city with no saloons, no slums, no debt collectors, and no strikes. A place where the lawns were trimmed to a single uniform height, where the flowers in the window boxes were selected by the company that owned them, and where a family could be reported to an inspector for hanging laundry in view of the street. Reporters called it the most perfect city in the world, and within 14 years of the day its first brick was laid, this flawless little paradise would explode into one of the bloodiest labor uprisings in American history, a strike so vast it would freeze the railroads of an entire continent and end with federal soldiers camped on its spotless green lawns. This is the story of how a utopia built to make men grateful ended up making them captives. And it begins with a single man who believed that a human being could be engineered as precisely as a railway car. His name was George Mortimer Pullman, born in 1831 in the small town of Brockton, New York. He was a mechanic's son with a talent for solving physical problems that other men found impossible. As a young contractor in Chicago in the 1850s, he made his first fortune doing something that sounded like magic. The city sat so low and so wet that its buildings flooded and rotted where they stood. So Pullman simply raised them, using thousands of jack screws turned by hundreds of men working in perfect coordination. He lifted entire hotels and blocks of brick out of the mud without cracking a wall or shattering a single pane of glass. It taught him a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. With enough control and enough coordination, you could move anything, even the ground itself. But his true empire was built on sleep. In the years after the Civil War, American railroads were racing across a vast continent, and passengers faced brutal overnight journeys crammed onto hard wooden benches. Pullman saw an opening. He built a railway sleeping car so luxurious it felt like a rolling hotel, with plush upholstery, polished woodwork, folding berths, and uniformed attendants who served travelers as though they were guests in a grand estate. He founded the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1867, and within a decade, his cars ran on rail lines from coast to coast. The Pullman name became a symbol of comfort, refinement, and quiet order. By the 1880s, thousands of laborers were building those cars in factories near Chicago, and that is exactly where Pullman's problem began, because the 1870s had terrified men like him. In 1877, the Great Railroad Strike swept the country, halting rail traffic and erupting into violent confrontations in city after city. To the wealthy men who ran American industry, it looked like the opening act of chaos. Workers, angry and desperate, packed into filthy tenements, gathering in saloons to organize against their employers. Pullman studied the situation the way he studied everything else, as a problem of engineering. The disorder of the industrial city, he decided, was not truly caused by wages, and it was not caused by power. It was caused by environment. Give a man a dirty, crowded, godless place to live, and you would produce a dangerous man. But give that same man clean air, green grass, indoor plumbing, and wholesome surroundings, and you would produce a loyal, sober, contented worker who would never so much as dream of striking. So he resolved to build that environment out of nothing. In the year 1880, Pullman began quietly buying up more than 4,000 acres of open prairie along the shore of Lake Calumet, roughly 14 miles south of the heart of Chicago. He hired a young architect named Solomon Beeman and a landscape designer named Nathan Barrett, and he handed them an extraordinary instruction. They were not merely to design a factory, They were to design an entire town, whole and complete, where every house, every street, every shop, every park, and every church would be built, owned, and governed by one company and one man. He would call it Pullman. It would be a model to the world, and every single inch of it would belong to him. Here is how life worked for a man in Pullman. He woke in a house he rented from George Pullman. He washed with water he bought from George Pullman. He lit his stove with gas he bought from George Pullman. He walked to a factory owned by George Pullman, built railway cars that made George Pullman rich, and collected a paycheck signed by George Pullman. If he wanted a book, he borrowed it from Pullman's library for a fee. If he wanted to pray, he rented a pew in Pullman's church. Every dollar the company paid him in wages had a way of flowing right back into the company's hands. It was a closed circle of money, and the man at the center of it owned the circle. On its surface, the town was genuinely astonishing. Where there had been empty prairie, the architect Solomon Beeman laid out neat streets of red brick row houses, each supplied with indoor plumbing, gas lighting, and running water at a time when most American laborers still hauled water by the bucket and shared an outhouse with a dozen neighbors. At the center stood the arcade building, a vast hall holding shops, a bank, a post office, a theater, and a library of thousands of volumes. There was a grand hotel named the Florence, after Pullman's favorite daughter, and an artificial lake, an athletic field, and flower beds tended by company gardeners. The entire works was driven by the enormous coreless steam engine that had once powered the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. Now purchased and installed as the beating heart of the factory. But behind the beauty was arithmetic. Pullman had not built this place as charity. He built it as an investment, and he expected it to pay. The company set rents on its houses roughly 20 to 25% higher than comparable housing in nearby neighborhoods, and it expected the town to return a profit of about 6% every year. The water piped in from Chicago was resold at a markup. The gas was sold at a markup. And here was the catch that mattered most. No worker in Pullman was permitted to buy his own home. He could only rent, and his lease could be ended on as little as 10 days' notice. A man might live in that house for 20 years and own nothing at the end of it but his furniture. The control ran deeper than money. There was no saloon anywhere in Pullman, for Pullman believed drink bred disorder, and the only bar sat inside the Hotel Florence, where a laborer's wages were not welcome. There was no independent newspaper, there were no town meetings, and no elected officials, because the town was not a democracy but a corporation. Inspectors walked the streets, making sure lawns were mowed and homes kept tidy, and a family judged untidy could be warned or removed. Even the church carried the same lesson. Pullman built a single handsome house of worship out of green serpentine stone, then charged congregations rent to use it. Most could not afford the price, and so the greenstone church often stood nearly empty, a monument to generosity with a bill attached. For a time, none of this seemed to matter, because the world was busy calling Pullman a miracle. Journalists came from across the country and from Europe to marvel at it. By the middle of the 1880s, more than 8,000 people lived there, and the number kept climbing. Pullman was celebrated as a model of enlightened industry, held up as proof that the bitter war between labor and capital could finally be solved, not with unions or strikes, but with good architecture and clean living. Yet the men who actually lived inside the miracle were starting to describe it differently. They noticed that their rent was deducted from their wages before they ever touched the money. They noticed that they had no vote over the place they called home. And they began, quietly, to use a word no promotional brochure would ever print. They called it feudal. A feudal paradise, however green its lawns, is only ever one bad winter away from becoming a cage. In 1893, the eyes of the world turned to Chicago. The world's Columbian Exposition had opened along the lakefront, a dazzling white city of domes and fountains, built to mark 400 years since Columbus first reached the Americas, and more than 27 million visitors poured through its gates. Many of them, having seen the wonders of the fair, climbed aboard a train and rode a few miles south to witness one wonder more. They came to walk the clean streets of Pullman. They strolled past the flower beds and the arcade and the shimmering artificial lake. And they went home telling everyone that they had glimpsed the future of the American worker. In these very years, the judges of an international exposition would go on to crown Pullman the most perfect town in the world. George Pullman had built his monument, and the entire planet seemed to agree that it was flawless. But a careful observer had already spotted the crack running beneath the storefront. Several years earlier, a young economist named Richard Ely had traveled to Pullman to study it, and in February of 1885, he published his findings in Harper's New Monthly magazine. Ely admired the beauty of the place. He praised the clean homes and the green lawns, and then he delivered a verdict that cut straight to the bone. The whole system, he wrote, was a benevolent, well-wishing feudalism. The people who lived in Pullman had no voice in their own government, no ownership of their own homes, no control over the conditions of their own lives. Everything was handed down from above by a single powerful man who meant well, but who ruled absolutely. It was, Ely concluded, un-American. A man could breathe the clean air of Pullman, but he was not, in any real sense, free. The unfreedom was not only political, it was financial, and it was designed to hold a man in place. A worker's rent was subtracted directly from his paycheck before the money ever reached his hands, so that on payday a man sometimes walked away with only a few cents to show for 2 weeks of labor. The rents themselves ran higher than what the same family would have paid a few blocks outside the town limits, yet moving those few blocks was rarely an option. If a man fell behind, he owed the company, and a man who owes his landlord, when his landlord is also his employer, cannot simply pack up and leave in search of better wages, because leaving the job means losing the house on 10 days' notice. To complain too loudly was to risk both at once. The paycheck and the roof were held in the same hand, and that hand could close whenever it chose. Slowly, a bitter kind of humor spread through the town, the humor of people who have realized they are trapped. Workers began repeating a grim little saying about the shape of a Pullman life. They said that a man was born in a Pullman house, was fed from the Pullman shop, was taught in the Pullman school and catechized in the Pullman church, and that when he died he would be buried in a Pullman cemetery and go at last to a Pullman hell. It was a joke, but no one told it as though it were funny. It was the sound of people describing a life with no exit. For years, the glossy fame held the whole illusion together. The visitors kept coming. The magazine articles kept praising, as long as the factory ran full and the wages arrived on time. Most families were willing to accept the trade, to give up their independence in exchange for order, cleanliness, and steady work. The bargain felt survivable, but every part of that bargain rested on one silent assumption that the wages would keep coming. Pullman had built a perfect machine for good times. He had never stopped to ask what would happen to his gilded town if the good times ever stopped. And in the summer of 1893, even as the crowds admired the fair, the good times were about to stop. The catastrophe did not begin in Pullman, it began on Wall Street. In the spring of 1893, a wave of bank failures and railroad bankruptcies set off the worst economic depression the United States had yet endured, a collapse remembered as the Panic of 1893. Businesses shut their doors across the country, millions of men lost their work, and the demand for expensive luxury railway cars, the very product that had built George Pullman's fortune, fell off a cliff. Orders dried up. The great factory that had once hummed day and night began to fall silent. Pullman's response was swift and, to his own mind, perfectly rational. To keep his company profitable, he slashed his workers' wages, cutting their pay by roughly 1/4, and in some departments a great deal more. He laid off hundreds of men. But there was one thing he refused to lower. He did not lower the rent. The rents on the company houses stayed exactly where they had always been. The price of water stayed the same. The price of gas stayed the same. And because the rent was still subtracted first, before a man's wages ever reached his hand, the arithmetic turned into a nightmare. Workers told of opening their pay envelopes to find almost nothing inside. A handful of pennies, sometimes nothing at all. Once the company had taken what it claimed it was owed. A man could labor a full week for one of the richest men in America and come home unable to feed his children. The gilded cage had finally shown its bars. In May of 1894, a committee of workers went to plead their case to the company. They asked simply that either their wages be raised or their rents be lowered so that a family might survive. Pullman refused. He insisted that the factory and the town were two entirely separate businesses, and that the town was entitled to its profit no matter what the factory paid. Within days, several members of that committee were laid off from their jobs. The workers were certain they were being punished for daring to speak up. On the 11th of May, 1894, the men of Pullman laid down their tools and walked out. Their cause was quickly taken up by a rising force in American labor, the American Railway Union, led by a determined organizer named Eugene Victor Debs. In late June, the union voted to act. Its members would refuse to move any train that carried a Pullman car anywhere in the country. The boycott spread with astonishing speed. Rail traffic across the western half of the nation ground to a halt as tens of thousands of railroad workers stood in solidarity with the men of one small factory town. What had begun as a local wage dispute had become a national uprising. Then the full weight of the federal government came down. Because United States mail was carried on trains coupled to Pullman cars, officials in Washington argued that halting those trains meant obstructing the mail itself. A sweeping court injunction was issued, ordering the strikers back to work. The Attorney General, Richard Olney, a man with deep ties to the railroads, moved aggressively to obtain it, and in early July, over the furious objection of the Illinois governor, John Peter Altgeld, President Grover Cleveland ordered federal troops into Chicago to break the strike. The arrival of soldiers turned a standoff into a tragedy. Anger boiled over. Rail cars were set ablaze in the yards, and in the clashes that followed, Around 30 people lost their lives across the country, and many more were injured. Property worth millions of dollars was destroyed. Debs was arrested and jailed for defying the court order. By the end of the summer, the strike was broken, the union shattered, and the workers who returned were forced to sign pledges never to unionize again. And so the deepest irony of the entire story revealed itself. George Pullman had built his perfect city for one purpose above all others: to make strikes impossible forever. Instead, his city had ignited one of the largest and most destructive strikes the United States had ever known. The dream of total control had produced total revolt. In the end, it was a court of law that delivered the final judgment on George Pullman's dream, and the judgment was devastating. In 1898, the Supreme Court of Illinois ruled that the Pullman Palace Car Company must sell off the entire town it had built. A company that manufactured railway cars, the court found, had no business owning the homes, the streets, the shops, and the churches of thousands of people, nor governing every detail of their lives. To own an entire town, the justices declared, was incompatible with the theory and the spirit of American free institutions. The great experiment was ordered to be taken apart, and for the first time, the workers of Pullman were permitted to buy the very houses they had rented for years, to become at long last the owners of their own front doors. But the man who had built it all did not live to hear the verdict. The strike of 1894 had transformed George Pullman from a celebrated visionary into one of the most despised men in the country. A federal commission appointed to investigate the disaster had studied his town and condemned its whole design, calling his refusal to lower rents in a time of hunger deeply un-American. The old praise had curdled into contempt. His health began to fail under the weight of it, and on the 19th of October, 1897, George Pullman died of heart failure. He was 66 years old. What happened next may be the most revealing detail in the entire story. Pullman and his family were terrified that his old workers, so many of whom had come to hate him, might dig up his body and desecrate his grave. So they took extraordinary measures to make his tomb impregnable. At Graceland Cemetery in Chicago, his lead-lined coffin was lowered into a deep pit and wrapped in layers of tar paper and asphalt. Then it was encased in a great block of reinforced concrete with heavy steel rails laid across it in a crisscrossing web, and still more concrete poured over that. The work took the better part of 2 days. The man who had built a city to set his workers free had, in his final act, sealed himself inside a fortress of concrete and steel, buried so deep and so heavily armored that he could never be reached. The Utopia's creator had, in the end, built himself the most permanent prison cell of all. Control of his company passed to a new president, a man named Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of Abraham Lincoln. The company would go on building railway cars for decades to come. But the town was no longer his. It was folded into the growing body of the city of Chicago, its residents now ordinary homeowners, its shops now ordinary shops. The decades that followed were not kind to it. As American industry shifted and the great railway car works eventually fell quiet, the neighborhood slid into a long decline. Buildings emptied and decayed. In 1998, an arsonist set fire to the historic administration building with its landmark clock tower, gutting the very heart of the old town. For a while, it seemed the whole place might simply crumble into forgotten ruin. But it did not vanish. Preservationists fought for decades to save what remained. And slowly the town was recognized for what it truly was, a monument to one of the most important and most cautionary experiments in American history. In 2015, President Barack Obama designated the site the Pullman National Monument, placing it under the care of the National Park Service so that visitors could walk those brick streets and understand what had been built there and what had gone so terribly wrong. And this is the lesson that still stands in the quiet streets of Pullman today, a paradise designed from above by a single man for the purpose of making people obedient is not really a paradise at all. It is a prison without bars. In the end, George Pullman never needed to build walls or install locks, because the true wall was always something else, the simple, crushing fact that a person could not own his own home, could not raise his own voice, could not be the master of his own life. That was the cage. And a cage, however beautiful, however green its lawns, however perfect its design, is still a cage.